A gang leader set out to make a statement by ambushing a royal guard, thinking it would earn him respect. But with one swift and brutal move, the guard turned the tables, leaving the leader and his entire crew sprawled on the ground, humiliated and defeated. Here's how it happened. But before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow at this same time, we'll be back with another powerful story that highlights the unmatched courage and discipline of the Royal Guard. You won't want to miss it. Evening shadows stretched across the cobblestones surrounding Buckingham Palace as another day of ceremonial duty drew toward its close. Standing motionless in his pristine scarlet uniform, Guardsman James Harrison embodied the timeless tradition of British military excellence. His towering buckskin hat cast a shadow over eyes that appeared fixed in the classic 1,000-yard stare. Yet beneath that ceremonial stillness lay the heightened awareness of a combat veteran who had learned to survive by noticing what others missed. The usual evening crowd had gathered, families documenting their London holiday, street artists sketching the iconic guards, and vendors hawking postcards and miniature soldiers to eager tourists. But threading through this innocent tapestry of tourism moved 5 individuals whose intentions were far from wholesome. They circled the courtyard with the patience of wolves, their dark hoodies and aggressive postures marking them as predators in search of prey. At the center of this brewing storm stood Marcus Viper Rodriguez, a man whose reputation for violence had been carved into the streets of East London through years of brutal encounters. The serpent tattoo coiling around his forearm told the story of a life dedicated to inflicting pain, while his cold eyes searched constantly for weakness to exploit. His crew moved in loose formation around him, each carrying the swagger of men who had never faced real consequence for their actions. Harrison's trained senses cataloged every detail without betraying the slightest movement. The way Rodriguez favored his left side suggested an old injury, probably from a knife fight. The youngest member of the gang kept touching his jacket pocket, nervous energy betraying the presence of a concealed weapon to others positioned themselves with the unconscious tactical awareness of predators. Though their street-learned instincts were crude compared to military precision, the courtyard bustled with innocent activity that would soon become the backdrop for something far more sinister. A class of French students listened to their teacher explain the historical significance of the guard rotation. An American family debated which angle would provide the best photograph. An elderly British couple shared a thermos of tea while watching the evening ceremony with the comfortable familiarity of locals who had witnessed this tradition countless times before. Rodriguez began his psychological assault with the calculated cruelty of someone who understood that intimidation was often more effective than immediate violence. His comments started as whispers to his crew, deliberately audible insults designed to provoke a reaction that would justify escalation. He questioned Harrison's masculinity, mocked the ceremonial uniform as costume play, and suggested that real men didn't stand around like ornaments for tourists to photograph. The verbal provocations revealed Rodriguez's fundamental misunderstanding of what he faced. Street intimidation worked by exploiting fear, embarrassment, and the human desire to avoid confrontation. But Harrison's training had conditioned him to channel stress into focus, to transform external pressure into internal clarity. Each insult only sharpened his awareness of the developing tactical situation. A security camera mounted discreetly on a nearby lamppost captured every moment of the unfolding drama. Though Harrison's attention remained focused on immediate threats rather than documentation, his peripheral vision tracked the movement of civilians, identifying potential cover positions and escape routes, while simultaneously monitoring the gang's positioning and body language for signs of imminent action. Rodriguez's psychological profile fit a pattern Harrison had encountered before in combat zones. Men who derived their sense of power from the fear they could generate in others, who measured their worth by the damage they could inflict, who had never learned to build anything constructive and therefore dedicated themselves to destruction. Such individuals were predictable in their unpredictability, capable of sudden violence, but lacking the discipline to employ it effectively. The gang's reputation preceded them through the underground networks of London's criminal element. The Serpent Crew, as they called themselves, had built their notoriety on attacking vulnerable targets: lone tourists, elderly pedestrians, anyone who appeared unlikely to offer effective resistance. Their previous victims included a retired teacher walking home from the library, a young mother pushing a pram through a park, and several tourists who had made the mistake of wandering into the wrong neighborhood after dark. Harrison's military record. Had Rodriguez bothered to research his target, would have revealed 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan, advanced training in close-quarters combat, and commendations for both valor and restraint under fire. His psychological evaluations consistently rated him as exceptionally stable under stress, with superior situational awareness and decision-making capabilities even in chaotic environments. The escalation continued as Rodriguez produced a butterfly knife, its blade flashing in the amber light of the palace illumination. The weapon was more than a tool, it was a symbol, a message, a promise of violence to come. He flipped it open with practiced flourish, the metallic click audible even over the ambient noise of tourist chatter and traffic from the nearby streets. Harrison's assessment of the weapon was automatic and professional. Butterfly knives looked impressive, but were actually inferior to fixed-blade alternatives. For serious combat, the folding mechanism created weak points. The handle design was awkward for sustained use, and the flashy opening technique prioritized intimidation over tactical effectiveness. Rodriguez held it like someone who had learned knife fighting from movies, rather than military instruction. The other gang members revealed their own armaments with theatrical timing, designed to maximize psychological impact. A sawed-off pool cue, brass knuckles, a heavy chain, and what appeared to be a homemade sap filled with metal pellets completed their arsenal. Street weapons, all crude but potentially lethal in the hands of men who had no qualms about using them on an apparently defenseless target. A young mother instinctively pulled her children closer as she sensed the shift in atmosphere, her maternal instincts recognizing danger even when her conscious mind hadn't yet processed the threat. Several tourists began backing away, their vacation mood evaporating as they realized they were witnessing something far more serious than street theater. Harrison's breathing remained controlled and even, but his muscle tension shifted subtly as his body prepared for action. Years of training had conditioned specific responses to specific stimuli. The sight of weapons triggered automatic preparation routines that operated below the level of conscious thought. His center of gravity lowered imperceptibly, his weight distribution adjusted for optimal mobility. His grip on his ceremonial rifle shifted to accommodate its potential use as a weapon. The tactical situation was complex but manageable. 5 opponents with improvised weapons against 1 trained soldier with extensive combat experience. The numbers were unfavorable, but numbers meant little when skill, training, and discipline entered the equation. Harrison had faced worse odds in the mountains of Afghanistan, where Taliban fighters had outnumbered his unit 3-1 and still found themselves outmatched by superior training and battlefield awareness. Rodriguez's final verbal challenge echoed across the courtyard with the finality of a declaration of war. His words were crude and threatening, designed to strip away the ceremonial dignity of Harrison's position and reduce the confrontation to its most primitive elements. He questioned whether the toy soldier would still look so proud with his face bleeding on the palace stones. The moment of decision had arrived, that crystalline instant when verbal intimidation transforms into physical action. Rodriguez lunged forward with his butterfly knife extended, his attack telegraphed by the tension in his shoulders and the shift in his stance. His crew moved simultaneously, converging from multiple angles in what they assumed would be an overwhelming assault on a helpless target. Harrison's response was instantaneous and devastating. The rifle butt snapped upward in a precise arc that caught Rodriguez's knife hand at the wrist, the impact shattering bone with an audible crack that silenced the surrounding tourists. The butterfly knife spun away across the cobblestones, its threat neutralized before it could find its target. But Harrison's counterattack was far from finished. Before Rodriguez could process the destruction of his weapon hand, Harrison's boot connected with his kneecap in a perfectly executed strike that combined military combat training with surgical precision. The kneecap, a relatively small bone that bears tremendous structural weight, displaced with a sickening pop that would require multiple surgeries to repair. Rodriguez collapsed immediately, his screams of pain and shock echoing off the palace walls as his body registered injuries that would leave him permanently disabled. The serpent tattoo on his arm seemed somehow diminished now, as if the violence it represented had been turned back upon itself with compound interest. The second attacker, wielding brass knuckles and expecting to face a ceremonial guard rather than a combat veteran, found himself the target of a palm strike to the nose that broke cartilage and sent blood streaming down his face. The blow was calculated to cause maximum disorientation. The broken nose would heal, but the immediate effect rendered him blind with tears and unable to continue his attack. The third gang member discovered that his chain weapon while intimidating, was useless against someone who understood leverage and momentum. Harrison used the weapon's own weight against its wielder, redirecting the attacker's force in a way that dislocated his shoulder and sent him sprawling across the courtyard in agony. The fourth crew member, seeing 3 of his associates down and bleeding, made the intelligent decision to flee. Unfortunately for him, Harrison's training included pursuit and apprehension techniques learned in environments where letting an enemy escape could mean death for innocent civilians. A perfectly executed leg sweep sent the would-be escapee crashing to the pavement, where he remained more from shock than injury. The fifth and final attacker, barely out of his teens and experiencing real violence for the first time, froze in place as he watched his crew systematically dismantled by a man who hadn't even broken his military bearing. This wasn't the easy victory over a helpless target that had been promised. This was a masterclass in why professional soldiers were different from street fighters. Harrison's demonstration of controlled violence had lasted exactly 11 seconds from first contact to final neutralization. In that brief span, he had disabled 5 armed attackers without suffering so much as a displaced piece of equipment. His burskin had remained perfectly positioned, his uniform unmarked, his posture maintaining the same rigid discipline that had characterized his stance before the attack began. The contrast was stark and unsettling. A man in ceremonial dress, who had just delivered a brutal lesson in the reality behind the pageantry, standing calmly among groaning, bleeding attackers, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The tourists who had witnessed the encounter stood in stunned silence, their cameras capturing the aftermath of something they never expected to see outside of action movies. Emergency sirens were already approaching, summoned by witnesses who recognized that this incident transcended ordinary street violence. Police, paramedics, and additional security personnel would arrive within minutes, but Harrison had already contained and neutralized every threat. His job now was to maintain security and provide an accurate account of the events. The first responder on scene was Inspector David Chen, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, who had investigated countless acts of street violence but had never encountered anything quite like this. The scene before him was simultaneously chaotic and orderly. 5 injured suspects requiring medical attention, dozens of witnesses with smartphones recording everything, and 1 completely composed guardsman who appeared ready to resume his ceremonial duties. Harrison's incident report was delivered in the crisp, factual tone that military training instilled. He identified each attacker by their position and weapons, described the sequence of events without editorial comment, and provided a precise timeline that could be verified against security footage. His account was professional, thorough, and notably devoid of any satisfaction or pride in the violence he had been forced to employ. Medical teams worked efficiently to stabilize Rodriguez's injuries, while crime scene photographers documented evidence and collected witness statements. The butterfly knife lay where it had fallen, its blade still extended, serving as physical proof of the violence that had been intended, but ultimately redirected back onto its perpetrators. Witness testimony painted a consistent picture of unprovoked aggression met with restrained but decisive force. The American tourist who had been filming showed his footage to investigators, providing multiple angles of an encounter that would soon become viral across social media platforms worldwide. Harrison's commanding officer arrived as the scene was being secured, his expression reflecting both concern for his soldiers' welfare and professional pride in how the situation had been handled. Incidents involving the Queen's Guard were rare, but when they occurred, they were managed with the same attention to detail that characterized every aspect of the regiment's operations. The investigation would be thorough but straightforward. Multiple security cameras, extensive witness testimony, and clear physical evidence all supported the same conclusion. 5 armed criminals had attacked a member of the Queen's Guard and had been neutralized using appropriate defensive force. The fact that Harrison had subdued all 5 attackers without causing permanent disability or death would be noted as evidence of his exceptional training and professional restraint. News of the incident spread rapidly through both official channels and social media networks. The hashtag Palace Guardian began trending within hours as video footage of the encounter was shared across platforms worldwide. Commentary ranged from admiration for Harrison's skill and composure to broader discussions about security, ceremonial military units, and the reality behind traditional pageantry. Rodriguez's crew found themselves facing serious criminal charges once they were medically stable enough to be processed. assault with deadly weapons, conspiracy to commit violence, and attacking a member of the military were just the beginning of their legal troubles. Their extensive criminal records meant that this incident would likely result in significant prison sentences for those capable of serving them. The Serpent Crew's reputation, built on intimidating vulnerable targets, was shattered along with their leader's bones. Their previous victims had included tourists, elderly residents, and anyone who appeared unlikely to fight back effectively. They had never encountered professional violence before, and the experience had destroyed both their confidence and their cohesion as a criminal organization. Harrison's service record, examined as part of the standard investigation, revealed a decorated military career including combat deployments, advanced tactical training, and commendations for both courage and restraint under fire. His psychological evaluations, updated regularly as part of his duties with the Queen's Guard, consistently showed a stable, disciplined individual with exceptional stress management capabilities. The incident report became required reading at military training facilities, not for the combat techniques employed, but for the level of restraint Harrison had demonstrated. Despite facing multiple armed attackers, he had used only the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat, while protecting civilian bystanders from harm. Media coverage explored the contrast between ceremonial duty and combat readiness, examining how units like the Queen's Guard represented both British tradition and very real military capability. Harrison declined all interview requests, maintaining the professional discretion his position required, but his actions provided a more eloquent statement than any words could have delivered. The aftermath extended far beyond the immediate medical and legal consequences for those directly involved. Tourism around Buckingham Palace increased dramatically as people hoped to witness the legendary discipline of the guards, though additional security measures were implemented as a precautionary response to the heightened attention. Rodriguez's recovery would be lengthy and incomplete. His shattered wrist required multiple surgeries and would never regain full function, while his displaced kneecap left him with a permanent limp that served as a daily reminder of his miscalculation. The serpent tattoo that had once symbolized his dangerous reputation now seemed like a cruel joke, marking a man whose predatory career had ended in a few seconds of professional violence. His crew disbanded after their release from medical care, their confidence shattered and their criminal enterprise dissolved. The youngest member, traumatized by his first encounter with real violence, eventually sought counseling and turned his life in a different direction. The others drifted into other criminal associations or served their prison sentences in relative obscurity. Harrison returned to duty the following day, his routine unchanged by his brief moment of international attention. He stood at his post with the same unwavering discipline, the same professional bearing, the same absolute commitment to duty that had characterized his service before the incident. The only difference was the increased respect in the eyes of his fellow guardsmen and the knowledge that he had upheld the finest traditions of his regiment. The encounter became a case study in military academies around the world, demonstrating how proper training and mental preparation could overcome numerical disadvantage and superior weaponry. Harrison's 11 seconds of defensive action were analyzed frame by frame, not to glorify violence but to understand how training, positioning, and discipline could transform a potentially tragic situation into a textbook example of professional force application. Security footage of the incident would be used in training programs for years afterward, though instructors focused on restraint and professionalism rather than combat techniques. The true lesson wasn't about fighting ability or military training, it was about the difference between violence and force, between brutality and discipline, between chaos and control. Years later, the incident remained a touchstone for discussions about ceremonial military units and their dual nature as both historical tradition and active military capability. Harrison's response had demonstrated that behind the pageantry and ritual lay individuals prepared to face whatever threats might emerge. From the most civilized environments, Rodriguez never fully recovered from his injuries, but his encounter with professional discipline eventually led him down a different path. Prison provided time for reflection, and vocational training gave him skills that didn't require intimidating others. He emerged as someone fundamentally changed by those 11 seconds that had redirected the entire trajectory of his life. The incident joined military history not as a tale of violence, but as an example of how proper training, discipline, and restraint could transform a dangerous situation into a demonstration of professional excellence. Harrison's actions embodied the highest ideals of military service, protecting others, maintaining order, and using force only when necessary and only to the extent required. The butterfly knife was eventually destroyed according to evidence protocols, but its brief appearance in the courtyard had served as a catalyst for something much larger. The encounter had revealed the true nature of both predator and protector, showing what happened when street brutality met military discipline. Tourist guides would eventually incorporate the story into their presentations, though they focused on the historical significance rather than the violence itself. The incident had become part of the palace's modern history, a reminder that the guards standing watch were more than ceremonial figures. They were active soldiers prepared to defend both tradition and public safety. The long-term implications of that evening extended into policy discussions about security at ceremonial sites, the training of tourist-facing military personnel, and the balance between accessibility and protection in democratic societies. Harrison's response had been textbook perfect, but it also highlighted the potential for violence in seemingly peaceful environments. Additional training protocols were developed based on analysis of the incident, though most focused on de-escalation techniques rather than combat applications. The goal was to prevent such confrontations rather than prepare for them, recognizing that Harrison's professional response had been exceptional rather than routine. The youngest gang member's transformation became a case study for youth intervention programs. His encounter with real violence had shocked him out of a criminal trajectory, leading him to community service and eventually to working with at-risk youth. He would later credit those 11 seconds of terror with saving his life by showing him where his choices were leading. Rodriguez's permanent disabilities served as a visible reminder throughout East London's criminal community that some targets were far more dangerous than they appeared. The Serpent Crew's dissolution created a power vacuum that was eventually filled by other organizations, but the memory of their leader's humiliation served as a cautionary tale about underestimating opponents. Harrison's career continued without fanfare, his exceptional day becoming simply another entry in his service record. He remained with the Queen's Guard for several more years, before accepting a position training military personnel in urban combat techniques. His experience that evening had qualified him as an expert in managing violence in civilian environments. The security cameras that had captured the incident were eventually upgraded, but the footage remained in archives as a training resource. Military analysts from multiple countries studied the encounter, not for its tactical innovations but for its demonstration of how individual training and discipline could overcome complex threats. In the end, the story transcended its violent origins to become something larger, a demonstration of the values that underpin professional military service and the difference between those who protect and those who prey upon others. Harrison's 11 seconds of action had lasted less time than it takes to read this sentence, but their impact rippled outward through years of consequences. The evening light that had illuminated the beginning of the encounter had given way to darkness by the time normal operations resumed, but the memory of those few minutes endured. It served as a reminder that civilization rests upon the willingness of trained individuals to stand between order and chaos, between the innocent and those who would harm them. Rodriguez's butterfly knife had been intended as an instrument of intimidation and violence, but it had instead become a catalyst for justice and redemption. The encounter had revealed the true character of everyone involved: the predator's weakness, the protector's strength, and the difference between those who build and those who destroy. The cobblestones of Buckingham Palace had witnessed centuries of history, from royal ceremonies to state occasions, but few events had demonstrated so clearly the values that the guards represented. Harrison's response that evening had embodied the finest traditions of military service, while protecting both the institution he served and the innocent civilians under his protection. The incident became a testament to the power of training, discipline, and moral clarity in the face of chaos and violence. It showed that true strength lay not in the ability to inflict harm, but in the wisdom to use force only when necessary, and the skill to apply it with precision and restraint. Those 11 seconds had revealed the difference between a warrior and a thug, between protection and predation, between order and chaos. The tourists who had witnessed the encounter would carry the memory for the rest of their lives, but more importantly, they had seen a demonstration of the values that make civilization possible. In a world where violence often seems random and senseless, Harrison's response had shown that sometimes good triumphs not through luck or circumstance, but through preparation, training, and the courage to act when action is required.